Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So last night, I love that. Last night, I began to speak about this week's Parashat Lekh Lekha. We talked a little bit about where it is that we start our story, and recognizing the fact that when we're asked to tell our story, we can start it in a number of different places. We can start it all the way back at the beginning. We can start it at Bereshit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We can start it later on in the story, as Rashi suggests maybe we should do, and start at chapter 12 of Exodus. HaChodesh Hazeh, this month is the first of months for all of you. Or we can start it in Lekh Lekha. Lekh Lekha, the beginning of our parsha, the beginning of our portion, is one of the most transitional moments that we have in the story of Genesis. Because the reality is everything is going to change afterwards. This is the story, this is where Abraham's story begins. This is the story and the part of the story where God tells Abraham, you need to get up, you need to go, leave everything behind, and go to a place that I will show you. And there are a number of traditional questions that our rabbis ask about this portion. So I want to look first at how this parsha begins. And you can find it actually if you open up your the larger of the books that are in front of you. You can find it on page 69, going into page 70. And the Hebrew reads, Vayomer Adonai el Avram, God said to Avram, Lekh Lekha, right? And how we translate that is going to be important. Here it just says, go forth from your native land, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. And then there is a series of promises that God makes to Avraham. I'll make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. You shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those that curse you. This is the first real promise that we get as a Jewish people from God. But the questions that the rabbis ask, and what I want to focus on a little bit today, is this phrasing of Lekh Lekha is actually a little unusual. First of all, if you look at the Hebrew, which you can see, it's actually on page 69, the very last word, there's a hyphen in between it, Lekh Lekha. The Hebrew letters, even if you don't read Hebrew, you can see the letters are identical of those two words, Lech and Lecha. The vowels are different, but the Hebrew letters are the same. And it's translated in a number of different ways. Here it's translated as go forth. And I would say that's one of the classic ways in which we can translate this as emphasis, right? As if we're not just saying go, but go forth, right? It's that emphasis that we like to hear in the movies and all that kind of stuff when we hear God's name or God's voice. This is a command. This is something that is a special moment. And therefore, that emphasis is perhaps one of the reasons that we have this doubling of the word Lekh Lekha. But another classical understanding of all of this actually comes from Rashi, one of our great commentators, and he says it actually means Lech, go, Lecha, for you, for yourself, right? That's what the word Lecha means. So he says God is not just saying go. God is not even just saying go for me, go because I tell you to. But according to Rashi, God is saying go because it's in your benefit. This is going to be good for you. And the question is, why does God feel the need to frame it that way? Well, there's a couple of options. Option number one is maybe Avraham was going to be reluctant, right? He wasn't going to want to go. And this was a way to say, hey, this is going to be okay for you. Go. Now, we don't see any evidence of Avraham being reluctant here. As a matter of fact, of all of our patriarchs, Avraham sometimes maybe even needs to show a little bit of reluctance, right? He just jumps right in. It seems like almost, God says, kill your son, your only son. He's like, sure, no problem, right? There needs to be a little bit of reluctance maybe in Avraham that we don't, so I don't think that's the reason here. We might argue that the ask that's being made here, it's a big deal. For anybody that has ever moved, right? Especially those of us who have moved away from where we grew up, where our family is, where that support is, right? Rabbi Erna is a long ways away from Buffalo. And he's happy about that because of the weather. True. But, when we grow up, when we move, when we make those types of moves, it can be a big deal, right? It can be overwhelming. It can be something that we're actually even afraid about. And so maybe this Lekh Lekha is God saying to Avraham, it's going to be okay, right? Ultimately, this is going to work out well for you. You're going to move away. You're going to go to Cornell. You're going to find your way to San Diego. You're going to be in a nice community, right? Works out pretty well. So that's another option, another way that we can understand this. But the third way that I want to bring up to you today is actually even a more literal understanding of Lekh Lekha. Lech means go. Lecha, the prefix lamed, literally can mean for, but it actually means to. To. So where are you going right now? Lechanut. I'm going to the store, right? That's what that word means. Lecha doesn't mean only for yourself. It actually means to yourself. Now, what does that mean, right? If we're going to understand this text as to yourself, not for yourself, what does that mean? And those people who are regulars here know that at some point I usually open it up. I've talked a lot already, so I want to hear what you think that means. If I'm going to translate this as Lekh Lekha, go to yourself, what does that mean, Michal? Possibly destiny, right? That this is your destiny, and therefore you're going to your own destiny. Okay? March? Maybe to a part of yourself that you don't know, or you haven't sat in Marge's office yet to figure it out, right? Spoken like the good therapist, right? Absolutely.
I was going to say basically the same thing, to find your true self.
To find your true self. So, one of the scariest things about moving in this way is the understanding that your support systems that are there might not be there in the same way. Now, obviously, in today's day and age, we've got phones, we've got Zoom, we've got all sorts of things. My kids are 27 and 24. We talk to them all the time, right? So yes, it's not like you're completely isolated, quite in the same way that it seems Avraham here was going to be. But that sense of leaving your support system can be overwhelming, can be very scary. And so maybe going to yourself is a recognition of an internal support system that we have that we don't often realize. We don't often realize. I'm going to get back to that in a second. I see over here we've got a couple people raising their hands. Neil, go ahead. You were first.
He's not going to have much nobody moved in that area. Everybody stayed there, and generation to generation, repeated the same cycle, like nobody moved, nobody challenged. This was just like unique for him to pick up and move, because cultures at that time just didn't do that.
So Neil is arguing, and I think you're correct, that people at that time didn't move in the way that Abraham did. And usually if you move, sort of everybody moved, right? The whole community got up and moved because, right, maybe you couldn't live in the area we were living anymore, so the whole village got up and moved and went somewhere else, and you kind of brought your support system along with you. And this is different. Do you want to say something?
I was gonna say, when you say Lekh Lekha, it's kind of going to yourself, but there's this almost expression of like it's you, Lekh Lekha. It's like, you got this. Like, I have faith, and go into yourself and trust yourself that you can do this. Because if you go just like to the next page, 71, he was doing okay. He took his wife and his brother's sons and all the wealth that they had amassed and the people they acquired. So he had his servants. And
So he did bring a little bit of a support system with him because he brought his family and he brought his servants. So he wasn't alone.
Like he was like, going to Home Depot and getting boxes and packing them himself and renting the U-Haul. Like, he had a good system to go help him with this. And I think that was part of that this is all of, when you think about Abraham, it's all about this trust.
Yeah.
And this is almost the beginning of that real explicit relationship that's coming into the text.
Yeah, I think so. And you mentioned the word trust. I'm going to get back to that in a little bit also. This raises the question for me, right, of where do you go to get answers when you don't have those places anymore, those people anymore that you've always gone to. At some point in time, you grow up. You can always call your parents for advice, but ultimately, who is it that you need to count on, and where does that come from? It's you. And I'm going to argue that go lecha, to yourself, actually is God saying to Abraham, look, this is going to be difficult, and this is going to be scary, and you're not going to know what's going to happen from one day to the next, but you have something that you're bringing with you that will be there to support you, and that is your values. Those are your values. You are who you are. And that set of values guides us in those moments when we don't hear that external voice. The external voice is nice. It's beautiful. We like to have that support. We like to have that advice. But we've all faced moments in our life where we have to make a decision. And where do we go to ultimately to make that decision? To ourselves. We look at our values. We look, and that brings those voices with us. It brings the voices of our parents. It brings the voices of our tradition and our values and our religion and our ethics and all of those things that make us who we are. That is what helps us face those things that are overwhelming and scary and ultimately unknown. And I want to share, I'm going to conclude. I want to share that I keep saying these last few weeks have been very difficult. But I've been saying that now for over a year. So I think we have to recognize that we live in tumultuous times. And whether we're talking about anti-Semitism, and we're talking about what we saw just happen in Amsterdam, which brought us back to the 1930s, and pogroms, and Jews being literally attacked on the streets. It's overwhelming and it's scary. I've spoken to a lot of people in these last couple of weeks, and whether you are elated or disconsolate at the election that just happened, this was a tough time. This was a tough time. And people really struggled to get through it and are struggling to figure out what it means. There are things that come up in our lives, and they seem to be coming up more and more often, unfortunately, that are these big moments that are scary and unknown, and we don't know where it's going to take us. And the message of this week's Parsha is ultimately, we need to be who we are. We need to do some searching, some thinking. We need to come back into our traditions, into our places that give us that nourishment so that we can fill up those reservoirs. And when we face those moments that are scary, where we're being told, Lech, go into this unknown, it's Lecha. We bring ourselves with us. And a lot of times people go back to this, and this is why I'm going to come back to what Diana said about trust and faith to some degree. And people say, this shows Abraham's faith and trust in God, that he was willing to get up and to go. It's one of the tests that we talk about that Abraham faces. And I think that is true. But ultimately, I also think this shows Abraham's faith and trust in himself. That he is going to be able to do this. And yes, it's amazing to have that support from God and that faith in God. That's the Lech part. God says, go. Abraham says, I go. But the Lecha is Abraham needs to bring himself, his values, and who he is, because ultimately, that's how he's going to face the unknown of the world. That's how we are going to face the unknown of the world. Whatever it may bring, we are going to deal with it as we are, who we are, and we're going to use those values and those ethics to help see us through even the scary and the challenging moments. Shabbat Shalom.